When Donald Trump looked directly into the cameras at the White House and declared that the clock is ticking on Iran, the phrase was not a diplomatic metaphor. It was an ultimatum with an implicit deadline, and for the first time since the escalation of 2020, the necessary elements for a direct military operation against the Iranian nuclear program were simultaneously positioned on the board. Aircraft carriers, strategic bomber squadrons, and submarines with cruise missile launch capability were converging on the Persian Gulf and the Sea of Oman in a concentration that Pentagon officials, speaking on condition of anonymity, described to Wall Street Journal reporters as the largest since the invasion of Iraq in 2003. The number that defines the scale of this crisis is this. According to estimates from the International Atomic Energy Agency, released in its most recent quarterly report, Iran had accumulated a stockpile of uranium enriched to 60% purity, sufficient to produce, with relatively rapid additional enrichment, fissile material for at least 4 nuclear devices, a capability leap that analysts at the Institute for Science and International Security described as the shortest breakout time ever recorded in the history of the Iranian program. The interval between the political decision to build a bomb and the acquisition of the necessary material, somewhere between 10 and 14 days. 10 days, the equivalent of the time between 2 editions of a weekly newspaper, and it was precisely that number that had transformed Trump's rhetoric from diplomatic pressure into operational preparation. But the central paradox of this crisis did not lie solely in the Iranian nuclear clock. It lay in the fact that the American maximum pressure strategy itself, applied with increasing intensity since Trump's return to the White House, had accelerated precisely the behavior it was meant to prevent. With every round of sanctions that strangled the Iranian economy, Tehran responded by spinning more centrifuges. With every military threat designed to deter the Ayatollah regime, the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Iran's most powerful military and economic force, which operates as a state within a state, deepened its enrichment as an existential insurance policy. The diplomatic weapon Washington was wielding to force negotiations was, in practice, shortening the very clock Trump claimed was ticking. The paradox had closed in on itself. And there was a second layer to this paradox that made the equation even more dangerous. Every American show of force in the Persian Gulf raised the risk premium, the additional value markets charge on the price of oil when there is instability in producing regions. On every barrel crossing the Strait of Hormuz, the maritime corridor approximately 50 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, through which roughly 21% of all the oil consumed on the planet passes every single day. That risk premium, which Goldman Sachs analysts estimated had already added between $12 and $18 to the price of each barrel, directly benefited Iranian revenues from clandestine exports. Sales conducted through a ghost fleet of tankers with transponders switched off, intermediaries in Dubai and Singapore, and buyers in China and India who paid at a discount, but in volumes that more than made up the difference. The threat that was supposed to weaken Iran was simultaneously financing Iran's resistance, and the greatest paradox of the entire crisis was precisely this. The weapon the American administration had deployed to wound its enemy was, at that very moment, feeding the very source of income that allowed the enemy to keep fighting. Consider what this number means in practice. According to estimates compiled by analysts at K-Pila, a company specializing in maritime cargo tracking, Iran was exporting between 1,300,000 and 1,600,000 barrels per day through this clandestine network, a volume that, at prices inflated by the very tension Washington was generating, produced revenues on the order of $40 to $50 billion annually for the Tehran regime. Enough money to sustain Hezbollah in Lebanon, finance the Houthis in Yemen, maintain Shia militias in Iraq, and above all, keep the centrifuges spinning at Natanz and Fordo, the 2 nuclear facilities at the center of American and Israeli crosshairs. But there was a layer we had not yet touched, and it changes the nature of this analysis entirely. The man articulating Israel's military strategy for this contingency was Israel's defense minister, whose record as a former chief of staff of the Israel Defense Forces included direct oversight of covert operations against the Iranian nuclear program and the coordination of long-range aerial exercises designed specifically to simulate strikes on underground facilities, protected by dozens of meters of concrete and rock. This general was not the emotional protagonist of this analysis. He was the operational coordinate of what Israel considered the ultimate existential threat, and the fact that, according to reporting from Yedioth Ahronoth, he had made 3 visits to the Pentagon in the previous 60 days, signaled a level of coordination that went far beyond routine diplomatic consultations. And here was the actor. The headlines were not mentioning with the frequency the data warranted. In the shadow of this confrontation between Washington, Tehran, and Jerusalem, China watched with calculated satisfaction. Beijing was, by far, the largest buyer of Iranian oil sold outside sanctions, absorbing, according to data from the consultancy Vortexa, approximately 80% of all Iranian clandestine exports. Every rhetorical escalation from Trump raised the price per barrel and strengthened China's negotiating position with Tehran. The more isolated Iran was in the formal market, the greater the discount Beijing could demand, and the greater Iran's dependence on China as a buyer of last resort. The crisis Trump was describing as a bilateral matter between Washington and Tehran was, at the level of deep economic structure, a mechanism for transferring strategic influence to China. Every American threat deepened the Sino-Iranian embrace. The equation had shifted. Step back for a moment and look at the full picture. The cost of a direct military operation against Iranian nuclear facilities was estimated by analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, the CSIS, at figures beginning in the range of $500 billion in the first year alone, accounting for Iranian retaliation through proxies in Lebanon, Iraq, and Yemen. The temporary closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the spike in global oil prices, to levels some models projected above $200 per barrel, and the need for American military mobilization on multiple simultaneous fronts. $500 billion, roughly the equivalent of Norway's entire GDP, consumed in 12 months of operations. And this was the optimistic scenario, one that assumed Iran would not retaliate with direct strikes against American bases in the region, which would trigger an escalation spiral whose ceiling no one at the Pentagon was willing to calculate publicly. The historical analogy that captures this dynamic with the greatest precision is not the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, where there were 2 rational actors with direct lines of communication. It is the July Crisis of 1914, the weeks that preceded the First World War, when a chain of alliance commitments, timed ultimatums, military mobilizations framed as defensive, and the absence of effective diplomatic channels between the actors who were actually making decisions, transformed a regional crisis in the Balkans into a civilizational catastrophe that consumed 17 million lives over 4 years. The parallel was not perfect, no historical analogy is, but the mechanism was disturbingly similar. Multiple actors with incompatible red lines, clocks running at different speeds, and the dangerous assumption that a demonstration of force would be sufficient to compel the other side to back down. In 1914, that assumption cost an entire generation. And here was what that layer revealed about the true nature of the crisis. The clock Trump claimed was ticking was not a single clock. It was at least 4, running at incompatible speeds. The Iranian nuclear clock, 10 to 14 days to break out. The American political clock, domestic pressures demanding visible results before the credibility window closed. The Israeli clock, the assessment that every additional week of Iranian enrichment reduced the effectiveness of a preemptive strike because the material could be dispersed to facilities that even Western intelligence had not fully mapped. And the global economic clock, the time the energy market could sustain the risk premium before inflationary pressure reached the very American voters Trump needed to keep on his side. 4 clocks, none of them synchronized, and no actor with the capacity to stop all of them at once. Every additional day was one more day of pressure on the countries most dependent on oil at stable prices, countries that would, in turn, generate pressure on Washington that the White House could sooner or later no longer afford to ignore. Europe, still dependent on energy imports following the rupture with Russian gas, was watching the Gulf escalation with the clarity of those who understood that open conflict would mean not just more expensive gasoline, but a potential industrial recession across the continent. Japan and South Korea, which imported significant volumes of oil and liquefied natural gas transiting the Strait of Hormuz, were already activating emergency energy protocols. India, the world's second-largest oil importer, was quietly pressing both Washington and Tehran through parallel diplomatic channels because any disruption to Gulf flows represented a direct blow to the economic stability of a country with 1,400,000,000 people. This was not merely a regional crisis. It was the first real test of who controlled the energy arteries of the 21st century, and the outcome of that test would redraw the map of global power for decades. Consider what this reveals about the dynamics of the conflict. Trump had constructed an ultimatum that depended on a specific premise, that the Iranian regime, faced with sufficient military and economic pressure, would choose to negotiate rather than accelerate. But the history of the Iranian nuclear program, from the first centrifuges secretly installed at Natanz in the early 2000s to the collapse of the 2015 nuclear agreement following the American withdrawal in 2018, consistently demonstrated the opposite pattern. Under extreme pressure, Tehran did not retreat. It advanced, and every advance made the next step of escalation more likely and more dangerous for everyone involved. The plan had failed before it was executed, not because the enemy was stronger, but because the enemy operated under a logic that pressure did not alter, only accelerated. What Trump's ultimatum had established was, therefore, a new paradigm of confrontation that permitted no stability, only escalation or capitulation, and neither side was showing any willingness to capitulate. The question that no analyst in Washington, Tehran, or Jerusalem was answering with sufficient clarity was this: when all four clocks simultaneously reach zero, the nuclear breakout, the American political window, the Israeli tolerance threshold, and the breaking point of the global energy market, who will be the first to act and what will remain of the board after that first move is made? If this analysis has brought clarity to a crisis that will define the coming months, subscribe and turn on notifications, because when the next clock stops, you will want to understand what happened before everyone else does. The hands have not stopped. They have only accelerated.